How did you find out about the ISC and what drew you to studying it initially?
Well, I came across the Intervision Song Contest when I started doing my research on the Eurovision Song Contest. I'm actually trained as a historian of Eastern Europe, and for my PhD, I wrote about popular music and politics in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was the only Eastern European country that participated in Eurovision during the Cold War. And in doing my research on that, I came across the Intervision Song Contest and thought that this would be an excellent research topic as well. There are so many myths about Intervision that I really felt it was my duty as a historian to find out the truth. First of all, this was not a Soviet-led initiative. Probably the most important myth that I challenge in my research. This was an initiative led, first of all, by the Czechoslovaks and their television station, and then by the Poles in the late 1970s. And it really reflected the openness and the liberalization that was being undertaken by the communist parties in these countries in these periods. The Soviets, the Russians, they actually weren't that interested in Intervision.
We are familiar with the structure of the EBU. OIRT is the Association of Broadcasters that was the Eastern Bloc Association. So what was the involvement of the Soviet Union in OIRT? And how much was that actually just a federation of all of the individual states' broadcasters? And how much of it had an element of Soviet control to it?
Well, of course, the Soviets were the dominant voice in the OIRT, the biggest country, the leader of the communist world, the biggest producer of radio and television programs as well. However, the OIRT was based in Prague because of Czechoslovakia's central position in the western part of Eastern Europe. It was geographically, geopolitically, the right place to put the headquarters. Also because Czechoslovakia, the Czech side especially, was the most technologically advanced part of the region. And when it comes to the actual Intervision network, which was established for television co-productions, the initial members were actually East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, not the Soviet Union. Because remember, at this time, there weren't satellites. So to connect countries, you needed to have terrestrial connections. And at that time, the Soviet Union was still too far away to connect. So if you think about the expansion of Eurovision, it started off in this core, let's say, centered around Switzerland, and then it expands. The key is, remember, this is a terrestrial network. So things have to connect by land, not by sky.
Starting in 1965, can you talk a bit about how the ISC related to a broader project of de-Stalinization?
So after the death of Stalin in 1953, Eastern Europe becomes more open to cooperation with the West. We also see Eastern Europe become more culturally liberal. And actually, the pioneer of all of this is Yugoslavia, which leaves the Eastern Bloc already in 1948. It's opposed to domination by the Soviet Union, domination by Stalin. It even joins the EBU as a founding member, and it debuts in Eurovision in 1961 and is the only Eastern European country that's allowed to participate in Eurovision during the Cold War as a result. So the Eastern European countries that were allied with the Soviet Union, none of them were allowed to participate in Eurovision.
Can you talk a little bit about Albania and what their relationship was both to de-Stalinization and therefore what their relationship was to the ISC?
I mentioned Yugoslavia as an exception, and Albania was also an exception, but to the other extreme. Albania wanted to stay loyal to a Stalinist line. It left the Eastern European organizations, including the OIRT, which meant that it never participated in Intervision, let alone Eurovision. Nonetheless, it did have its own national pop song festival called very simply the Song Festival. And these days, that's where Albanians select their entry for Eurovision. Albanians did watch Eurovision during the Cold War, though subversively. They would watch it through Greek or Italian broadcasts.
OIRT had a suggestion to do a joint contest. Can you talk about that?
Yes, that happened in 1964, and the head of Czechoslovak television, Jiří Pelikan, proposed this to the EBU then, and the EBU rejected the idea. They weren't convinced that Eurovision should be continued. There were discussions on this every year until the late 1970s, whether the format was good, whether it was popular enough, whether it cost too much. Young people watching, the music was often criticized for not being modern enough. And actually, this is something that Eurovision and Intervision share in common. Especially in the 1960s, I found that there was a lot of concern in Eurovision that the songs weren't fashionable. And in Intervision, I also found that there was criticism within Czechoslovak television that the entries were too much of these ballads, chansons, and they really wanted things, to become livelier, faster. Both Eurovision and Intervision were, we could say, in the 1960s, behind the trends. But Prague was really experiencing a renaissance in the early 1960s. This was also seen, for example, in the establishment of a jazz festival in Prague in 1964, as well as the Golden Prague Television Festival in the same year. And it was through the Golden Prague Television Festival that Czechoslovak television also launched Intervision.
One big difference between Eurovision and the ISC is that the ISC is not hosted by the winning country. So hosting decisions became much more of a choice and carried real significance. So while 1965 was in Prague that we just talked about, it then moved in 66 and 67 and then again in 68. Can you talk about where and what the significance was?
In 1966 and 1967, things changed because the Slovaks always felt that they were in the shadow of the Czechs. This is why it was decided in 1966 and 1967 that Intervision should be staged in Bratislava. From January 1968, you have this very liberal leadership of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. It's actually led by Alexander Dubček, who is a Slovak, and he institutes these liberalizing reforms, which make Czechoslovakia the most open and liberal part of the Eastern Bloc. Czechoslovak television ends up moving Intervision to Karlovy Vary, a resort town which is very symbolically located near the border with West Germany. In 1968, Intervision opens up to include participation by Western European countries. This includes West Germany, Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, Spain, Finland, and Yugoslavia are also there. Finland is very special because it's the only member of both the Intervision and Eurovision networks. So Intervision takes on a very special meaning in 1968. It becomes the first time that a pan-European song contest is staged in Europe, including countries from both East and West. With the quashing of the Prague Spring in 1968, pop singers had to decide what their choices were, what they were prepared to sacrifice. The leadership of Czechoslovak television was removed. We saw the liberalizing figures being purged. Jiří Pelikan was among them, and he actually went into exile afterwards in Italy. And he stood for the first European Parliament elections in 1979, and he won a seat then, exactly, representing Italy. So I think here the most interesting story is that of Marta Kubišová, who sang with the famous Czech singer Helena Vondráčková in Intervision, and in late 1968 they went on to form the group The Golden Kids. The problem was that Marta Kubišová sang a song called Pray for Marta. And in 1970, because of this, she was censored and not allowed to perform in public anymore. Helena Vondráčková, on the other hand, became a key popular music export of Czechoslovakia because she didn't criticize the regime. She had a big career in the West, especially in West Germany, just like Karel Gott did. And together with Karel Gott, she signed this anti-charter document in 1977, which criticized the dissidents who had rallied behind the Charter 77 cause. Helena Vondráčková was the artist who represented Czechoslovakia in this first revival of Intervision because she was on the side of the government.
Can you talk about the Helsinki Accords and how those became the backdrop and inspiration for the ISC in Poland?
So the Helsinki Accords signed in 1975. Basically, every European state is a signatory. They have agreements on human rights, on cultural cooperation, and they also recognize the borders between European states as they are. It's in this context that Polish television decides to revive the idea of Intervision. It takes place in Sopot from 1977 to 1980. And the aim of Polish television then is to include participants even from farther afield. We even have Cuba participating, for example, or Japan. You have a parallel competition occurring in Intervision in Poland for record companies. So you have this very commercial dimension as well. And that's really interesting because in the late 1970s, there was this debate going on in Eurovision regarding the influence of record companies on the contest, especially record companies from bigger countries like the UK and West Germany. And it was especially the Nordic countries that were complaining about this influence of commercial record companies. Because remember, these are public service broadcasters, not commercial private broadcasters. So to have the influence of commercial companies is something that can be quite controversial, especially in the Nordic countries, which have this socialist democratic ethos at this time. So it's very interesting then that the communist song contest is actually more brazenly commercial at this time than the capitalist one.
Can you talk about the Western acts being sent to the ISC?
I think the most interesting anecdote is that of Boney M, which appeared in Sopot in 1979. They sang the song Rasputin, which was censored in the Soviet Union because it was about this spiritual advisor to the Russian Tsarist family that was deposed by the communists, a way for the Poles to highlight their autonomy from the Soviet Union. So we have the liberalizing reforms in Poland setting the scene for the revival of Intervision in 1977, the staging of this quite lavish song contest, which, promotes Poland as a modern, prosperous, and open part of the Eastern Bloc. But there are also economic challenges that the Poles are facing at the time, and these come to a head in 1980 when 1 week before the staging of Intervision in Sopot, there is a strike that begins in the Lenin shipyards. There are protests happening across Poland at this time, so this is not an isolated event, but it's a very important event because a week after Intervision happens in Sopot, at this time, the solidarity movement is established, and that really challenges the authority of the communist government in Poland. So much so that martial law is introduced in Poland in 1981 as a way to suppress these strikes.
And we get to 2008, and this time Russia is the one who hosts the ISC.
It's funny that the Russians thought that they were reviving Intervision when they restaged it in Sochi in 2008. This wasn't a revival because when you think about what we've been talking about in this episode, this was something that was led during the Cold War by the Czechoslovaks, by the Poles. It was an idea about bringing East and West together. It was not an idea of competing with the West, of competing with Eurovision. I think this was an attempt by the Russians to challenge Eurovision, especially after they invested so much money into their entries. But then, of course, in 2008, they did eventually manage to win Eurovision, and they staged it in Moscow in 2009, which was until then the most expensive and extravagant Eurovision ever staged. And that just went to show how important Eurovision was for Putin's Russia to promote itself on the international stage.
Putin's been making noises about a 2024 revival of the ISC.
This is not the first time there have been so-called plans for this. When Conchita Wurst won Eurovision in 2014, then we heard calls from Russian politicians for Intervision to be revived as well, as a response, let's say, to the pro-gay politics of Eurovision.
This has been really, really great. Dean, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
This has been really, really amazing.
No, it's really been a pleasure, and I hope you enjoy This Is Eurovision in Malmö.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We'll be there. So.
Oh, great. Yeah, then let me know.
Yeah.
It would be great to see you live.
All the mysteries of the Euroverse.